The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the Hall of Mirrors in the Palacio Real, Madrid. It was 1829. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, the Desired, had just hurled a crystal vase, not in rage against a political enemy, but in frustration at a woman. This was his fourth wife, the young Maria Cristina, and the object of his fixation was not her heart, but his own lineage. The monarch known as Rey Felón, the Phelan King, was in the grip of a different kind of perversion, the terror of an empty cradle. In his private chambers, surrounded by wax-sealed documents and the suffocating scent of cheap incense, the court whispers confirmed a chilling truth. His royal impotence, masked by grotesque marital rituals, was threatening the crown. The symbolic motif is the empty cradle, a silent polished wood box representing the dynasty's end. How could a king who obsessed over his bloodline simultaneously commit acts that drove his wives to fear? And what secret was sealed away in the palace archives regarding his affliction? Did his body betray the king, or did his spirit? If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. And now, back to the story. The royal crisis, the dynasty's fear of collapse, shifted dramatically from the grand public stage of the Cortes to the suffocating private rooms of the successive queens. Ferdinand VII's control was not focused solely on state enemies, but on the very women intended to secure his legacy. Each marriage, from his earliest attempts to his final, desperate union with Maria Cristina, represented a cruel and calculated descent into a form of psychological captivity. The institutional control exercised by the Spanish court was absolute, achieved not through visible chains, but through an inflexible, deadening protocol that extinguished personhood. The moment a bride arrived at the Palacio Real, she was stripped of her individual identity by the merciless rigor of court etiquette. She ceased to be an autonomous woman and was immediately designated a functional object, a vessel, a mere number in the sequence of potential royal mothers. Her role was marked by the escalating, almost hysterical desperation of the king to see the empty cradle filled. The reigns of his second and third queens were marred by private rituals that are only vaguely hinted at in the surviving letters of foreign ambassadors and the cautious memoirs of the domestic staff. These acts, historians suggest, were less about the natural process of procreation and far more about the king's strange performative display of personal dominance over intimacy. The massive stone walls of the palace, cold and indifferent, seemed to absorb the queen's fear and the chill of his indifferent touch. Examining the private correspondence between court physicians and ecclesiastical advisors provides oblique evidence of a quiet, profound will to resist among the high-ranking attendants. These women, witnesses to the queen's distress, understood they could not openly rebel against the crowned head. Instead, they maintained silent, empathetic vigils, offering small but essential mercies: a perfectly warmed blanket, a sympathetic glance, or an unsanctioned moment of human connection against the crushing weight of royal indifference. Their acts were wordless, a refusal to fully endorse the institutional lie that the king's peculiar torment was simply a natural part of royal duty. This quiet personal resistance was severely tested when the king, in moments of calculated manipulation, began to offer his own warped version of mercy. If the queens would only comply with certain highly specific, often non-procreative demands in private, acts solely designed to reinforce the illusion of his absolute control, he would promise them a temporary reprieve from the court's most draining official duties, perhaps even a brief return to a semblance of personal dignity. But the hidden, terrible price of this false kindness was clear: the complete, tacit acceptance of their humiliation and the slow, inescapable erosion of their personal spirit. This was never compassion. It was pure control, dressed in the thinnest veil of a marital truce. Every offered kindness became just another softer stone in the wall of their elaborate, gilded prison, securing the terrible dynastic truth of the empty cradle inside. The silent refusal of the attendants was often the only flicker of genuine light in those increasingly dark chambers. Did silence offer protection, or did it invite darker things? A king who claimed to desire heirs was more concerned with the performance of power than the act itself. Did his tyranny over others mask a deeper tyranny within? The test was not political loyalty, but physical submission, demanded in the suffocating theater of the royal bedchamber. The condition was stark, yet unwritten. Comply with the king's specific isolating demands, maintain the public facade of fertility, and secure your comfort. The alternative was to vanish, to suffer the king's neglect, endure the whispers of barrenness, and face eventual political marginalization. The fate of queens Maria Antonia and Maria Isabel, who died young and childless, served as a cold warning. The test was one of endurance against calculated emotional and spiritual deprivation. The moment of refusal, when it came, was not a grand oration against tyranny, but a single, profoundly quiet act. Records from the Portuguese embassy in 1819 concerning Queen Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony suggest her reaction to the expected intimacies was not hysterical, but one of deep religious revulsion. Her refusal line was reportedly a simple, resolute rejection of the king's increasingly grotesque requirements, whispered not as defiance, but as fact. I cannot violate what God has sealed within me. This initiated the escalation. Soft pressure gave way to complete deprivation. The king isolated Maria Josepha, withholding his presence and thus all political influence. She was cut off from her confidants. Deprivation moved to silence. The court was instructed to treat her as an invisible fixture, a failed experiment. The silence of the vast palace, broken only by the cold clinking of iron braziers and the heavy tread of guards, was meant to break her resolve. Yet, this isolation became her armor. What was intended to shatter her piety instead forged it into something unbreakable. The discipline she found in her religious devotion, the vow of silent obedience she made to herself, allowed her to withstand the king's peculiar brand of cold tyranny. She inverted the meaning of her confinement. Her silence, meant to denote failure, became a steadfast refusal to participate in the king's psychological theatrics. The empty cradle, meant to shame her, became a symbol of her moral purity, a space she refused to desecrate. The core why of Ferdinand VII's perversion was finally resolved in this crucible. His actions were not driven by simple lust or cruelty, but by a deep-seated, paralyzing insecurity regarding his own legitimacy and ability to reproduce. His sexual tyranny was a political substitute, a constant ritualistic attempt to exert absolute power over the one domain where he was fundamentally powerless. The price of this pathology was paid by his wives, whose dignity and lives were sacrificed to maintain the fiction of a potent, divinely appointed king. They were the victims of his political impotence, not his carnal desire. When the body failed the crown, how did the mind compensate? He sought not an heir, but a witness to his control, and they offered only cold resistance. Was the king's greatest prison the throne he sat upon? The endurance of the queens, particularly Maria Josepha Amalia, was not a surrender, but a silent spiritual rebirth. This profound interior life left behind subtle, almost indecipherable evidence. Years after her death, a hidden place was discovered, a small sealed room adjacent to her private chapel in the Palacio de Aranjuez. Within this small space, tucked beneath a worn tapestry, was a modest wooden chest. Inside, there was no great treasure or political manifesto, but a collection of simple objects tied directly to the recurring motif of the empty cradle. The chest contained dried infant swaddling clothes, never used, and a series of carved wooden figures, not dolls, but symbolic representations of the virtues she sought: silence, piety, and endurance. Crucially, there was a small, crudely carved wooden cradle about the length of a hand. It was unpolished, unlike the elaborate, cold mahogany of the official palace cradle. This small, personal carving represented the queen's wordless right of memory, a recognition of her failed duty to the crown, but also a sanctification of the empty space as a choice, not a curse. This ritual act, touching the wood, rearranging the simple figures, was her daily, silent protest. Grounding this find with one cautious evidence cue, a later excavation of the official palace archives, dated around 1830, revealed a single, highly unusual entry in the royal chamberlain's ledger. It was a requisition for a specific expensive medicinal salve, requested not for the king, but for Queen Maria Josepha Amalia, accompanied by a note in the physician's hand referencing a persistent affliction related to profound anxiety and persistent fear of intimacy. The purchase order was immediately followed by a note canceling the order, signed by the king's private secretary. This is the hidden truth. The royal court knew the emotional and spiritual price the queens were paying. The affliction was not an inherent barrenness, but a psychological trauma inflicted by the king's demands, a trauma that the court was prepared to medicate, but which the king ultimately chose to silence. What was hidden was the court's complicity. They understood the nature of the king's dysfunction and the psychological violence he inflicted, yet they actively managed the cover-up to protect the image of the crown. The queen's perceived barrenness was a carefully orchestrated lie. Their distress was merely a political inconvenience. They knew the nature of the sickness, but feared the cure. The little wooden cradle was not a sign of grief, but an altar to defiance. Can stone walls hold back the truth forever? The legacy of Ferdinand VII was defined by an intentional, slow-motion erasure. After his death in 1833, the court protocols and official histories systematically withheld ink from the painful details of his private life. The entries concerning his second and third marriages, particularly, were left blank or conspicuously vague in the public registers, a deliberate act of historical omission designed to protect the monarchy's stability under the regency of Maria Christina. Burned pages or names referenced only by cryptic initials became the default record. The goal was to eliminate the possibility that the king's perversions, his dysfunction and cruelty, could ever be linked to the political turmoil or the instability of the succession. Distant witnesses, primarily the ambassadors and spies of foreign powers like Britain and France, left behind whispers in their dispatches, not proofs. They reported the queen's isolation and distress, the unnatural melancholy of the palace, but their accounts were political commentary, not verifiable evidence of domestic abuse. They saw the consequences, but never truly penetrated the inner chambers. These whispers were easily dismissed by the Spanish crown as foreign interference or propaganda. The ultimate act of erasure was the way history remembered the king himself. The official history celebrated him as the restorer of absolutism, the desired monarch who secured the line, thanks to his fourth queen, who finally bore him a daughter. The trauma inflicted upon the previous queens was relegated to gossip, rendered meaningless by the eventual sight of a child in the royal lineage. The cruel cycle of the court consumed and then conveniently forgot its victims. The story returns to the shattered porcelain in the Hall of Mirrors. That sound, the immediate action that started this chronicle, was not just the king's frustrated rage. It was the echo of all the queens who came before, whose suffering was as fragile as the crystal vase, and just as easily swept into oblivion. It was the sound of the dynasty violently attempting to maintain its facade, a single, sharp sound trying to drown out the silent truth of the empty cradle. Did the crown secure its future, or only seal its guilt? Subscribe, hit the bell, and like. The greatest lie is the history that refuses to be written.